The morning sun glinted off the silver wings of the F-80 shooting star as Lieutenant Russell Brown patrolled the high-altitude skies near the Yalu River. It was November 8th in the year 1950, and the air was thin and dangerously cold. Brown scanned the horizon with intense focus, looking for any sign of enemy activity in the vast blue expanse. Suddenly, a flash of silver appeared in the distance, moving at a speed that defied the capabilities of any propeller-driven aircraft. The object closing in was a MiG-15 fighter jet bearing the Red Star markings. The world was about to witness the first ever combat engagement between two jet-powered aircraft. The sheer velocity of the encounter changed everything that military strategists understood about aerial warfare. For decades, pilots had relied on the growl of piston engines and the turning of propellers to claw their way through the sky. Now the combatants were strapped into sleek metal tubes that screamed through the stratosphere at nearly the speed of sound. The reaction times required for this new form of fighting were mere fractions of a second. A pilot could spot an enemy and be past them before their heart had time to beat once. This was the dawn of the jet age, and the rules of engagement were being rewritten in real time. The stakes for the United Nations forces on the Korean peninsula could not have been higher during that frozen winter. The ground troops were fighting a desperate battle against overwhelming numbers, and they relied entirely on air support to survive. If the communist forces achieved air superiority, the bombers and supply planes sustaining the United Nations effort would be swept from the sky. The introduction of the Soviet-built MiG-15 threatened to tip the balance of power irrevocably. American bombers like the B-29 Superfortress were suddenly vulnerable to these fast, sweeping interceptors that could slash through their formations with devastating cannon fire. Into this high-pressure cockpit stepped men like James Jabara, who would soon become legends of aviation history. Jabara was a determined pilot from Kansas who had already flown combat missions during the Second World War. He was small in stature but possessed an aggressive spirit and keen eyesight that made him a natural hunter in the skies. He smoked cigars and wore his confidence like a suit of armor. For pilots like Jabara, the appearance of the MiG-15 was not just a threat but a personal challenge. They were eager to test their skills and their machines against the best technology the Eastern Bloc could produce. The initial encounters proved that the older American jets like the F-80 Shooting Star and F-84 Thunderjet were outmatched by the Soviet newcomer. The MiG-15 could climb faster and fly higher than anything the United Nations Command had in their inventory. It possessed a swept-wing design that allowed it to approach the speed of sound with greater stability. The American pilots found themselves looking up at enemies they could not reach and being bounced by fighters they could not catch. A sense of urgency gripped the military leadership in Washington as they realized their technological edge had vanished overnight. The answer to this crisis arrived in the form of the North American F86 Sabre, which was hurriedly shipped to the Korean theater. The Sabre was the United States Air Force's first swept-wing fighter, and it was the only machine capable of tangling with the MiG-15 on equal terms. With its sleek fuselage and bubble canopy offering excellent visibility, the F-86 became the chariot of choice for the American aces. The arrival of the Sabre leveled the playing field and set the stage for a duel that would rage for the next 3 years. The pilots finally had a weapon that matched their courage. The arena for this epic confrontation was a slice of airspace in northwestern North Korea that the pilots nicknamed MiG Alley. This corridor ran along the southern bank of the Yalu River, which marked the border with China. The geography heavily favored the communist forces who could dash across the river to safety, where United Nations rules of engagement forbade pursuit. The American pilots had to patrol this dangerous neighborhood, knowing that enemy jets could dive from the sanctuary of Chinese airspace at any moment. It was a tactical disadvantage that required constant vigilance and nerves of steel. Political constraints added a layer of frustration to the already dangerous missions flown by the Sabre pilots. The United Nations mandate strictly prohibited crossing the Yalu River into Manchuria to attack enemy airfields or supply lines. This meant the communist pilots could take off and climb to altitude in complete safety before crossing the river to fight. The Americans watched their adversaries forming up in the distance, unable to strike until the enemy chose to engage. This sanctuary allowed the MiG pilots to dictate the terms of battle, initiating combat only when they held the advantage of altitude and surprise. Despite these handicaps, the American pilots possessed a crucial advantage in the form of experience and training. Many of the Sabre pilots were veterans of the Second World War, with hundreds of combat hours recorded in their logbooks. They understood the geometry of air combat and the importance of teamwork in a chaotic dogfight. In contrast, many of the North Korean and Chinese pilots were novices with limited flight time. However, the equation was complicated by the presence of covert Soviet pilots who were combat veterans themselves. These Russian flyers were the true masters of the MiG-15, and they posed a lethal threat. The presence of Soviet pilots in the Korean skies was one of the worst-kept secrets of the conflict. Known among the Americans as honchos, these Russian aviators wore Chinese uniforms and flew jets with North Korean markings to maintain plausible deniability. They communicated in Russian over the radio frequencies, which the American intelligence officers monitored closely. The battles between the Sabre pilots and the honchos were intense affairs, where the best aviators of the superpowers clashed directly. Both sides went to great lengths to conceal this direct conflict to avoid sparking a Third World War. The tactics evolved rapidly as both sides learned the strengths and weaknesses of their respective machines. The MiG-15 had a superior climb rate and a tighter turning radius at high altitude, which allowed its pilots to attack from above. The F-86 Sabre was heavier, but it could dive faster and was more stable at high speeds. American pilots learned to lure the MiGs down to lower altitudes where the Sabre handled better. It became a deadly game of cat and mouse where kinetic energy was the currency of survival. Losing speed meant becoming a sitting duck for the enemy cannons. Technological innovation played a massive role in the outcome of these high-speed engagements. The F-86 Sabre was equipped with a radar-ranging gunsight that calculated the lead required to hit a moving target. This allowed American pilots to fire accurately from greater distances than their adversaries. The MiG-15 relied on a simpler gyroscopic sight that required the pilot to get much closer to ensure a hit. Additionally, the Sabre pilots wore G-suits that inflated to prevent blood from pooling in their legs during high-G maneuvers. This kept them conscious and alert while their opponents often blacked out. The physical toll on the pilots was immense as they pulled heavy G-forces while twisting their machines through the sky. A sharp turn at 600 miles per hour could make a pilot feel as if an elephant were sitting on his chest. Their vision would tunnel and their limbs would feel like light weights. In this physically punishing environment, they had to maintain situational awareness and track multiple fast-moving targets. One moment of fixation on a single enemy could allow another to slip in behind undetected. Survival required a head on a swivel and absolute trust in a wingman. One of the most dramatic days of the air war occurred on April 12, 1951, known as Black Thursday. A massive formation of B-29 Superfortress bombers was attacked by dozens of MiG-15s near the Yalu River. The escorting F-84 Thunderjets were too slow to protect the bombers from the slashing attacks of the jets. 3 bombers were shot down and several others were heavily damaged. The disaster forced the United States Air Force to rethink its strategy and commit more F-86 Sabres to bomber escort duties. It was a painful lesson in the obsolescence of propeller-driven aircraft. James Jabara etched his name into history on May 20, 1951, during a massive furball involving dozens of jets. Despite his drop tanks failing to jettison, which created drag and slowed his aircraft, Jabara dove into the fight. He managed to outmaneuver 2 MiG-15s and score hits that sent them spiraling into the ground. With those victories, he became the first American jet ace achieving 5 confirmed kills. His achievement was broadcast around the world, making him an instant celebrity and a symbol of American air power. Jabara proved that skill could overcome mechanical disadvantages. The psychological warfare over MiG Alley was as intense as the physical combat. The radio waves were filled with taunts and misinformation as both sides tried to confuse the other. American pilots often reported hearing Russian voices cursing when a MiG was hit or shouting orders during an attack. The knowledge that they were fighting the Soviet Union directly added a grim determination to the mission. Every victory was seen not just as a tactical win, but as a triumph of democracy over communism. The pilots knew they were holding the line against a global adversary. While the fighters grabbed the headlines, the rescue crews performed heroic work saving downed pilots. If a Sabre pilot was hit and had to eject, he would float down into hostile territory, often miles behind enemy lines. Helicopters, which were still a relatively new technology in warfare, were dispatched to pick them up. These rescue missions were fraught with danger, as the slow-moving choppers were vulnerable to ground fire. The sight of a rescue helicopter was the most beautiful thing a downed airman could hope to see. It meant the difference between a prisoner of war camp and returning home. The maintenance crews on the ground fought their own battle against the elements and mechanical failure. The Korean winter was brutal, with temperatures dropping far below zero. Mechanics had to work on freezing metal surfaces with bare hands to keep the delicate jet engines operational. Runways were often covered in ice and snow, making takeoffs and landings treacherous. The dedication of these ground crews ensured that the Sabres were ready to fly whenever the weather cleared. Without their tireless efforts, the air war would have ground to a halt. As the war dragged on into 1952 and 1953, new aces emerged to challenge the records set by the early pioneers. Captain Joseph McConnell became the top-scoring American ace of the conflict, with 16 confirmed victories. McConnell was a master of energy management and possessed an uncanny ability to anticipate the moves of his opponents. His success was a testament to the improved tactics and the refined F models of the Sabre that were reaching the front lines. The race for the title of top ace became a morale booster for the entire force. The introduction of the F86 F model gave the American pilots a significant performance boost in the final year of the war. This version featured a new wing design that improved maneuverability at high altitudes and higher speeds. It narrowed the performance gap with the MiG-15, allowing the Sabre pilots to fight aggressively even in the rarefied air near the service ceiling. The Communists responded with their own upgrades, but the momentum had shifted. The American pilots were now more aggressive and confident, pushing their machines to the absolute limit of their structural integrity. One of the unsung heroes of the air war was the United States Navy pilot Royce Williams. In a single engagement, he faced off against 7 Soviet MiG-15s while flying an F-9F Panther. In a desperate 35-minute dogfight, Williams shot down 4 of the enemy jets before limping his heavily damaged plane back to the carrier. For decades, his feat was classified to avoid escalating tensions with the Soviet Union. His story exemplifies the incredible individual heroism that occurred in the skies over Korea. It remains one of the most remarkable feats of airmanship in history. The sheer numbers involved in the air war were staggering, considering the limited geographic area of MiG Alley. On some days, hundreds of jets would be in the air, simultaneously creating a chaotic swirl of contrails and exploding ordnance. The sky would be filled with the smoke of burning aircraft and the white silk of parachutes. Pilots described the experience as a terrifying confusion where death could come from any direction. Yet amidst this chaos, they maintained discipline and executed complex tactical maneuvers. It was a testament to the rigorous training of the United States Air Force. Night fighters also played a crucial role in the conflict, engaging enemy aircraft under the cover of darkness. The F-94 Starfighter and the F-3D Skyknight were equipped with advanced radar systems that allowed them to track and destroy enemy planes without ever seeing them visually. These missions required a different kind of courage, as pilots flew into the pitch-black void, relying entirely on their instruments. The radar operators in the back seats were just as vital as the pilots guiding them toward invisible targets. This electronic warfare was a precursor to modern air combat. The final months of the war saw a flurry of activity as both sides sought to improve their bargaining position at the peace talks. The pilots flew mission after mission, often multiple times a day, to maintain pressure on the enemy. The intensity of the combat reached a fever pitch, with record numbers of MiGs claimed in the spring of 1953. The Sabre pilots were relentless, sweeping the skies clear of enemy fighters to allow the fighter bombers to pound ground targets. They wanted to ensure that when the guns finally fell silent, they held the upper hand. When the armistice was finally signed in July 1953, the sound of jet engines faded from the skies over the Yalu. The war ended in a stalemate on the ground, but the air war had established a clear victor in terms of technology and tactics. The United States Air Force claimed a kill ratio of 10-1 in favor of the Sabre, though modern analysis suggests the number was likely lower. Regardless of the statistics, the F-86 had proven itself as the premier dogfighter of its generation. The lessons learned in Korea would shape air combat doctrine for decades. The legacy of the Korean Air War extended far beyond the ceasefire line. It was the crucible where the United States Air Force transitioned from a propeller-driven force to a modern jet-age power. The deficiencies in air-to-air missile technology, which was still in its infancy, reinforced the need for pilots to be skilled in gunnery and maneuvering. This emphasis on dogfighting skills would eventually lead to the establishment of specialized training schools like Top Gun. The pilots of the Korean War had written the textbook on jet combat. The question that lingered for historians was just how close the world had come to a wider conflict during those air battles. We now know that the superpowers were directly engaging each other in a hot war above the clouds while maintaining a cold peace on the diplomatic stage. The restraint shown by both sides in not expanding the war beyond the Korean peninsula saved the world from a potential nuclear exchange. MiG Alley was the pressure valve where the tensions of the Cold War were released in bursts of cannon fire. Today, the F-86 Sabre and the MiG-15 stand as museum pieces, silent witnesses to a pivotal moment in history. They represent the transition point between the mechanical age of warfare and the electronic age. The men who flew them are mostly gone, but their stories of courage and skill remain. They were the pioneers of a new frontier, pushing the limits of human endurance and machine capability. Their duels in the high, thin air over Korea remain the purest example of jet-on-jet combat ever recorded. As we look back on the first jet dogfights, we are reminded of the rapid pace of technological progress in the 20th century. In the span of a few years, aviation went from wood and canvas biplanes to supersonic metal jets. The Korean War was the testing ground for this new reality. It proved that while machines had changed, the fundamental nature of aerial warfare remained the same. It was still a contest of will and skill between two human beings suspended in the sky. The roar of the jet engine over the Korean peninsula signaled the end of one era and the beginning of another. The romantic image of the scarf-wearing pilot in an open cockpit was replaced by the G-suit-clad warrior in a pressurized cabin. Yet the spirit of the fighter pilot remained unchanged. The courage required to fly headlong into enemy fire at 600 miles per hour is timeless. The pilots of the Korean War set a standard of excellence that modern aviators still strive to emulate. In the final analysis, the air war over Korea was a victory for American training and adaptability. Faced with a surprise technological leap by the enemy, the United States Air Force adapted its tactics and introduced new equipment to regain the initiative. The F-86 Sabre became a legend not just because of its design, but because of the men who flew it. They mastered a new form of warfare in the harshest conditions imaginable. Their legacy is etched in the contrails of every jet fighter that flies today. The Korean War is often called the Forgotten War, but for those who looked up at the skies, it was unforgettable. The sight of silver wings flashing in the sun and the sound of sonic booms rolling across the mountains left an indelible mark. It was a time when the sky was the ultimate battleground, and the pilots were the knights of the modern age. We honor their service and their sacrifice by remembering the history they made. They were the first to fight in the jet age, and they remain the best. The combat between the Sabre and the MiG was a duel of distinct philosophies in aircraft design. The Soviet machine was rugged, simple, and built for a specific interceptor role. The American machine was complex, refined, and designed for air superiority. These design philosophies reflected the societies that built them. In the end, the flexibility and adaptability of the American approach proved decisive. It was a lesson that would influence military procurement for the rest of the Cold War. As the sun sets on this chapter of history, we are left with the image of two silver jets circling each other in the high blue sky. It is an image of tension and beauty, of deadly intent and graceful motion. The Korean War air combat was a brief but intense period that changed the world. It defined the parameters of modern air power and proved that control of the air is essential for victory on the ground. The echoes of those dogfights still resonate in the strategy of every modern air force. The story of the first jet dogfights is a testament to human ingenuity and bravery. It reminds us that even as technology advances, the human element remains the deciding factor in war. The pilots who flew in MiG Alley faced the unknown with courage and skill. They pushed the envelope of what was possible, and in doing so, they shaped the future. Their history is a whisper of time that speaks of speed, danger, and the relentless pursuit of excellence.